Hello everyone and welcome to the first monthly episode, the February episode of Exploring Brain and Mind. I hope you checked out the older episodes that have been released on YouTube over the past few weeks since the last episode, 53 as it was called, on most providers. And there will be more older episodes released now on YouTube in between the monthly ones that are now brand new ones. We often discuss the brain as a biological constant, a machine made of neurons and synapses. However, while our neurobiology is consistent, the way we interpret the mind, in quotes, is deeply influenced by the cultural soil in which we grow and grow up. Today we're going back in time to ask, where did the concept of mental illness ever start? We'll trace the path from ancient Greek balancing humus to the global industry it is today. And we explore why the Western medical model isn't the only way to understand a hurting soul. We'll ask, has the Western way of defining the mind overwritten thousands of years of global wisdom? So let's start exploring. And now exploration starts with the question of how did we get from spirits to syringes? Long before we had the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there was something called trephinations, and that was drilling holes in skulls to release spirits. How gory was that? That must have been terrifying to live in those days when they had this kind of method. But the real shift began in ancient Greece with Hippocrates, who argued that mental distress was a physical imbalance of humors, in quotes, rather than a curse. Now, humors has nothing to do with the humor as in ha ha ha, laughing and all that. That humors relates to the four humors or humoralism, and that was an ancient Greek medical theory. Then by the 18th century, the West moved towards the Asylum Era. These were meant to be sanctuaries, but they quickly became warehouses for those people that the Industrial Revolution couldn't use. Everything changed with the accidental discovery of chlorpromazine, the first antipsychotic. This was the birth of the medical model, the idea that a pill could fix a mind. While this led to the closing of horrific institutions, it also birthed the mental health business. By the 1980s, with the rise of the DSM-3, and aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, mental health shifted from a local community concern to a standardized global industry. Now, this was kind of a brief overview, but I'm going to go more in depth into the history now. So the history of mental health is a long journey from spirits and demons to neurons and neurotransmitters. It is a fascinating, often dark and deeply complex evolution. The concept of mental illness didn't start in one single place, but two distinct vibes emerged early on: the supernatural and the biological. The supernatural angle came from Mesopotamia and Egypt from around 6500 BCE. Mental distress was often seen as a religious punishment or demonic possession. The treatment was the aforementioned trephination, which is drilling a hole in the skull to let the spirit out. From ancient Greek, around 400 BCE, came a more scientific approach or view. Hippocrates rejected the demon theory. He argued that mental illness was a physical disease caused by an imbalance of the four humors, And those four humors in that theory and at that time were blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. But then there was also another perspective that came from ancient India from around 400 BCE, the Charaka Samhita. I hope I pronounced that right. So this Ayurvedic text described mental disorder as imbalance in the mind's qualities, sattva, rajas, and tamas, focusing on diet and lifestyle as cures. In our societies that are classed as more the Western societies, for centuries, madness, in quotes, was managed by families or the church. Remember those times when there was witches and they were burned because people thought they were doing weird stuff, like natural healers, and came often in that category as well. Witch hunts, witch burnings, inquisitions, torture of different thinking people, differently behaving people, something like that. That went on for a long time. This changed in the 18th and 19th century with the rise of the asylum. Asylum actually means sanctuary, so asylums were originally meant to be safe havens. But the reality was they quickly became overcrowded warehouses for the undesirables. And goodness knows what has been done to people in those asylums. They might have been chained, put in cages and things like that. Then in the late 1700s, figures like Philippe Pinel in France and William Turk in England began unchaining patients, arguing that they were human beings who responded better to kindness than to cages. So they had put people in cages and chained them up. Then came the shift to science and pharma. The medicalization of mental health took off in the late 19th century, but the pharmaceutical revolution didn't hit until the 1950s. So the first steps were from 1880 till about 1920s that Sigmund Freud introduced psychoanalysis. Mental illness was no longer just about the brain or spirits, it was about the unconscious mind and childhood trauma. Then the 1950s breakthrough was the big turning point. The accidental discovery of chlorpromazine, mentioned before already, which is sometimes also called thorazine, in 1952 changed everything. It was the first antipsychotic drug. Then came the deinstitutionalization. Because of these new drugs, people believed patients could be treated at home rather than in hospitals. This led to the mass closing of asylums in the 1960s and 1970s, though the community support system often failed to materialize. And I think we still see that happening nowadays. When did it become a business, almost like an industry? So the transition from healthcare to a massive global industry happened primarily in the 1980s and 90s. The version of the DSM-3, this diagnostic manual, shifted towards strictly checklist-style diagnosis, making it much easier to match a specific pill to a specific code. Now, the next lot is a bit more geared to the American market because we in the UK do not have direct-to-consumer ads. So this is more US focused. In the 1990s, pharma companies began advertising directly to patients. You've seen the commercials that may ask, are you sad? Ask your doctor about whatever the product is just called. Then came the SSRI boom. The release of Prozac in 1987 turned mental health into a lifestyle market. It wasn't just for the severely ill anymore. It was for anyone struggling with the friction of daily life. And today, the global mental health market is valued at nearly $400 billion. This business side is a double-edged sword. It funds massive research and reduces stigma through awareness, is trying to reduce stigma through awareness, which is still a massive work in progress. But it also risks over-medicalizing normal human emotions like grief or shyness for profit. So how does psychology fit in with all this? While mental illness was historically handled by priests or medical doctors, psychology was the bridge that connected the two. It shifted the focus from just fixing a broken body to understanding a complex mind. Modern psychology didn't just contribute to these concepts, it fundamentally rewrote the map of the human experience. Here is how that evolution shaped what we think of as mental health today. Before the 1800s, mental illness was often seen as a failure of the will or a biological curse. Psychology introduced the idea that personality, environment, and development mattered. By opening the first psychology lab in 1879, Wilhelm Wundt moved the study of the mind out of philosophy and into the laboratory. This made mental processes something you could measure and study scientifically. Psychology introduced statistical norms, a concept of normality, by defining what a normal, in quotes, cognitive process looked like. It inadvertently created the modern definition of, in quotes, abnormal psychology. Psychology provided the diverse tools we use for treatment today. Without these schools of thought, we would likely only have pills or surgery. Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis or the talk cure, popularized the idea that our past influences our present. He moved treatment from the hospital ward to the therapist's couch. People like the behaviorist B.F. Skinner argued that illness was often just learned behavior. This led to behavioral therapy, which is still used today to treat phobias and OCD. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, the humanists, shifted the concept from mental illness, as in what is wrong with you, to mental health, as in how can you reach your full potential. This birthed the modern wellness and self-help movements. Then in the 1960s and 70s, the cognitive revolution occurred. Psychologists began viewing the brain like a computer, processing, storing, and retrieving information. This led to cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, created by Aaron Beck. CBT is currently the gold standard of non-pharmaceutical treatment. It combined the scientific rigor of behaviorism with the internal focus of psychology, teaching people to reprogram their thought patterns. Psychology also provided the metrics that allowed the mental health business to scale. For example, with standardized testing, IQ tests, personality assessments, like for example, the MMPI, and diagnostic screenings turned mental states into data. Or there's also the insurance validation. These psychological metrics gave insurance companies and the business side of health the data they needed to decide what treatments were valid and how much they should cost. And today we have a biopsychosocial model. This is the peak of this evolution. It acknowledges that mental health is a mix of biology, being genetics and chemistry, psychology, which is about thoughts and the trauma, and the social, as in poverty and support systems, for example. Psychology's greatest contribution was proving that you cannot treat the chemical imbalance, i.e. the biology, without also addressing the person, as in psychology. After going into all that long spiel of history, now let's look more of, is this actually working? Is this actually useful, this pharmaceutical approach, this modern day thinking about mental health and mental illness? In a world of psychological research, there is a significant data skew known as the weird bias. Weird as in weird, actually, the word weird, W-E-I-R-D. And that weird stands for populations that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. While these societies represent only about 12% of the global population, they account for the vast majority of our psychological data. This creates a standard, in quotes, for mental health that is highly individualistic. In the West, we prioritize autonomy. Mental health is viewed as an internal, personal journey. In contrast, many cultures in Asia, Africa, and Latin America operate on collectivist frameworks. Here, the self is defined by its relationship to the group. In these contexts, mental distress isn't just a chemical imbalance in one person's brain. It is seen as a fracture in the social or family fabric. Interestingly, the World Health Organization found that individuals with schizophrenia in developing nations, rather than developed nations, in developing nations often show higher rates of clinical remission than those in developed nations. Why? Because these cultures often provide higher social integration, whereas the Western medicalized model can inadvertently isolate the individual or the undesirables. They need to be kept away. One of the most striking differences in global mental health is how symptoms physically manifest. In Western clinical settings, we lean towards psychologization, expressing distress through emotional vocabulary like sadness, hopelessness, or low self-esteem. However, in many parts of the world, mental distress is experienced and communicated through the body. This is known as somatization. And I've got two examples here. In China, research indicates that depression is frequently reported as neurasthenia, or in Chinese, now mind my pronunciation again, Shenjing Shuai Ruo. Sounds a bit more Japanese, but it is, I am sure, Chinese. And that is characterized by physical exhaustion and headaches rather than overt emotional low. While in the Middle East, you may hear descriptions of heart distress or liver pain as metaphors for deep psychological grief. This isn't a lack of emotional awareness. Rather, it reflects a holistic view where the mind and body are not seen as separate entities. For a professional, understanding this is vital. If we only look for sadness, we may miss a patient who is crying out for help through physical pain. Mind and body are connected, deeply interconnected. There is no doubt. And finally, let's look at the stigma and the paradox of the medical model. We often assume that as a society moved towards a biological explanation of mental illness, as in viewing it as a disease like diabetes, the stigma will decrease. However, the data reveals a more complex reality. In some cultures, mental health issues are framed through a moral or spiritual lens. While this can lead to exclusion, it sometimes allows for a path of redemption, in quotes, through ritual or community healing. In the West, while the broken brain narrative reduces personal blame, it can inadvertently create essentialist stigma. Some studies suggest that if the public views a condition as purely genetic or biological, they may perceive the individual as permanently flawed or unpredictable, which can actually increase social distancing and exclusion. Understanding these nuances helps us realize that destigmatization isn't just about more biology, it's about more humanity. And the conclusion is, to treat the brain effectively, we must respect the mind's context. Global mental health shouldn't be about exporting Western pills to the rest of the world. It should be more about a mutual exchange, combining Western neurobiology with the global wisdom of social harmony. And that may include some ancient wisdoms, going back to and including ancient wisdoms, alternative perspectives as well. Something that the pharma industry might not like, because that would take away a little bit of their business empire. I am highly skeptical of the industry. I've researched the history and I have come to the conclusion that we need a more holistic and better health prevention and health care system. So that needed to be said at the end. But before I finish the episode, I want to share 3 books that I highly recommend. I've been a bit more into reading again, reading as in listening to audiobooks due to sight issues. And I've got 3 books that I highly recommend. Now, the first one is called Military Mindsets, Lessons from the Battlefield. It's by Anne Middleton. And it talks a lot about the mindset that the military instills and trains people, and that helps them. However, all the lessons he goes into are also very well applicable and can be integrated into everyday life. The next one is called Altered Traits. Science reveals how meditation changes your mind, brain, and body. And that book is by Daniel Goleman, very well known for his work on emotional intelligence, and Richard Davidson. They talk a lot about studies that were done, how the meditation and mindfulness and mental health links, how all that came about. So it's very interesting to read that one. And that third one is called Training the Mind, Healing the Body. It is by Deepak Chopra and Dr. David Simon. It is an eye-opener, a very important book that goes into understanding the body and the mind, how it is linked. It goes into health prevention as well. It should be a must-read and an inclusion in the medical studies in the Western world. It would massively help people who want to go in the medical field to really serve and understand their patients better. And that finally concludes the February episode of Exploring Brain and Mind. There will be another one coming, another brand new one, on the 4th of March. The weeks in between will be, as it was in the past month, releases on YouTube of past old episodes that had not been on YouTube before. If you would like to give the YouTube channel a little bit of love, I would very much appreciate that. But keep supporting, liking, subscribing, also leaving reviews or comments on Apple, on Spotify, Amazon Music, and the aforesaid YouTube. It would be great. And I hope to have you back listening again next time.